Hi writers! I'm Alyssa Hollingsworth, the author of the 11th Trade, and today I want to talk about if your chapter deserves to be here. Sometimes when I'm reading new writers' work, I come across chapters that just aren't doing a whole lot. And I know that I was guilty of this too. Am guilty of this, probably. Especially when I was first starting out. Sometimes it can feel like you have thing A and then a period of time needs to pass and then thing B needs to happen. And that period of time might result in chapters that just aren't doing a whole lot. So here are some warning signs that your chapter might not be working. Your characters end up in the same place they were at the end of the chapter that they were at the beginning. You, the writer, find your mind wandering, especially when you're rereading it. The ending or hook for your chapter is just summarizing what just happened in the chapter. So a good chapter works on a few different levels. It connects the various plot and narrative threads and moves them forward. Bonus different threads at once. It also raises the stakes and increases tension. And of course, it develops the characters and or their relationship to each other. So there are a couple of ways to check on your chapter's strength and potentially revise to make it stronger. One question to ask yourself is, what are the stakes? Stakes in fiction basically boil down to this. If blank happens, blank will happen. So, for instance, in my debut, the opening chapter stakes would be, if Sammy can't catch the thief who has stolen his instrument, then his grandfather's heart will be broken. And the hook that chapter lands on is he doesn't catch the thief, so what's going to happen next? You can also check your chapter by making sure all of your characters in it have goals that they're striving for. Very obvious one in my first chapter. Sammy's goal is to not let his instrument be stolen. But sometimes if you find your characters just sort of wandering around and talking at each other, it means that you've lost sight of what your character goals are. In any story, a character should always have goals or things they are striving for, even if it's something a little bit silly. I've read books where the character's goal is just getting to a fan event, or cosplaying, or something like that. It still feels important to me as the reader because it is important to that character. But they have a purpose and they're going after it, which is what makes me want to read about them. You can also check the chapter by asking, where is the conflict? Even if your chapter is primarily about kind of building happy feelings, especially in like a romantic situation, it's okay to have sort of a honeymoon, meet and greety, getting to know each other, day on the towns chapter. Those can work, but there still has to be a source of tension or conflict involved. And each of these chapters should be building on the conflict of the last chapter. This is something I had a really hard time with in book 2 of The Invisible Boy. And actually, me and my editor had to go back to the basics and remind ourselves how conflict builds. And I've got this from a video that I'll link to below from the writers of Seinfeld, which I've never seen or cared about, but it's really solid writing advice. The key is that between each scene or chapter, you need to think of a because or therefore phrase. So instead of Sammy loses his instrument, then goes and tells his grandfather, it's because Sammy lost his instrument, he has to tell his grandfather. So that the action in the first one directly corresponds with what happens in the next one. This is especially important if you're juggling multiple storylines or settings. In order to keep the reader tracking with you through changes in cast, setting, or theme, all of these pieces need to be somehow interlinked so that they're building on each other towards a climax. Otherwise, your reader feels lost and the chapter's not working. Now, maybe you're not sure which chapters are the weakest in your novel. One thing I did after I wrote the 11th Trade, the first draft, was I took note cards and I made myself, without looking at what I had written, write down chapter 1, whatever I could remember happened in chapter 1. and I taped it to my wall and then did chapter 2, and so on and so on and so on. I found when I had them all assembled that I was missing a chapter, but I could not for the life of me remember what happened in that chapter. And that chapter was sort of a Sammy and his grandfather wander around Boston chapter, which when I say that, probably already clued you into it wasn't working hard enough. If you can write out all of the things that happen in your individual chapters and link one to the next, you're in a pretty good place. But if there are certain chapters or scenes or periods of the story where you don't really remember what order it goes in or what exactly happens, then that's a good indicator you may have gotten lost. So how do you fix it? The answer that I like the most, but everybody else probably hates the most, is you cut it. If it's not working, take it out, replace it with something that works better. If you need to replace it at all, sometimes it's just filler that nobody needs. If you feel in your gut that this chapter does have a purpose, then there are ways to make it work harder. Normally what it needs is more tension, more character development, or higher stakes. And sometimes it needs all three. In the 11th Trade, the chapter that was Sammy and his grandfather wandering around Boston needed to be there to help further establish Sammy's relationship with his grandfather, and also to show one of the first instances where Sammy has a little bit of a PTSD flashback, which becomes very important later in the story. But with just Sammy and his grandfather wandering around, it wasn't doing enough to be worthy of the space it was taking in my book. What I ended up doing was changing the scene so that Sammy is interacting with his grandfather, but also with friends from their mosque. I needed more on-screen time with the people that they were becoming friends with at the mosque, and I needed this scene still to happen. So I came up with a way to incorporate those relationships he was building with the people from the mosque, along with the relationship that's developing between him and his grandfather. And I also pulled in the main plot thread, which was the trades that he's doing. So what was a scene of him wandering around Boston with his grandfather and then having a little bit of a PTSD flashback becomes a scene of him wandering through a specific part of Boston with his grandfather, joining his new friends for a social gathering, connecting with two people who he'd like to do trades with, and then having his small PTSD attack. More tension because the tension of the trades is brought directly into the scene. Higher stakes because he has to make these connections with these people in order for his plan to work. And because when he has his PTSD attack, he's in the company of people who are not his family members and do not understand what's going on. And more character development. We get to see how Sammy and his grandfather interact together, and then also how Sammy interacts with this larger group of people. So those are some tips for seeing which chapters might be too weak and need some more work, and ways to potentially fix them. I hope that was helpful to you. If you like what you saw, give it a thumbs up, and until next time, keep writing.